Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We have the pleasure of having two of our team members from Innovia, Galen Norman and Don Dyke, and they're going to be presenting on exploring security and permissions in Business Central. And we do want this to be interactive, so if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand, feel free, and you can get your questions addressed live. And we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Galen and Don, and they're going to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Angie. All right. As Angie said, my name is Galen Norman. I'm an application consultant with Innovia on Team Ignite. You see me here, you see me there. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to knock off my camera right now because I'm distracting. But I've been with Innovia for a little over 2 years. Before that, I was an end user in BC and nav, so I've got a little bit of experience on the end user and consultant side.
All right, and like Angie said, my name's Don Dyke. I've been doing nav and Business Central for a long time, like 25 years now. I've been with Innovia for a little over 2 years. And my background is I'm a CPA, a Canadian version of the CPAs. So yeah, and been involved with doing security implementations and stuff for most of those years. So I'll kill my camera as well, and we'll get going.
All right, so we're going to get into the agenda. So our presentation will be broken down into 3 sections. Authentication, so who can get into your system and how. Authorization, once in your system, what are users allowed to do? And auditing, are your users able to use a system effectively, and are they doing it appropriately for their roles? So we'll give you a little summary here, and I'll hand it over to Don.
All right, so first thing is security. So security is, well, I guess that's what our presentation is about, right? So security, there's authentication, authorization, and auditing. This diagram here illustrates the layered security model in Business Central. First, we have to authenticate users before they can even go into Business Central. Secondly, we have to authorize the users. That involves making sure they have the appropriate license, as well as being assigned the permissions that they need. We can authorize based on the database, the company, the object that they need access to, as well as even records that they have access to.
So the next step in security in Business Central is authentication. And it's basically just, is the user valid in the system? If you're on BC SaaS, if you're in the cloud, there's only one way that a user can get authenticated, and it's through Entra. I've been saying it Entra for a year now, and I was corrected a couple of weeks ago. It's Entra. That is what was known as Azure Active Directory. This is where all of your user validation is going to take place if you're on the cloud. The other option, if you're on-prem, is there's a variety of authentications. You can use Entra, you can use your Windows authentication, like what you use to log in, local access, things like that. It's just security is not tied directly to BC Nav. If you're on-prem, it's tied more to whatever your IT system has set up for it.
All right, so authorization, this is where we look at what a user is authorized to see and do in Business Central. All right, so now that the user is authenticated, we need to know how to control what they're able to see and do. So the first thing we need to be able to do is to assign permissions to them. Right, so authorization is all about permissions. In fact, you could say that the building blocks of authorization are permissions. Permissions are granted very specifically by giving users access to various types of objects. They're listed here on the slide. We will cover all of this in more detail later on, but for now you can see that there are a number of different object types. And at this point you might ask, well, why do we even need to assign permissions? Can't we just turn on access to everything? The best practice is to only give permissions, give users permissions to do what they need. It can be really dangerous to give full permissions to users, even if they're allowed to see everything. Giving full access means that they could accidentally change setup tables that define how the system works, or even delete things that they didn't mean to. Okay, so now we're going to get into the structure of permissions. So as we talked about, permissions are very detailed. There are thousands of objects, literally thousands of objects, tables, pages, reports in the system. Assigning each of them to each person in detail would take forever. But this diagram, the permissions are the top one, right? So they're the smallest level. We can assign these thousands of permissions to each person. Now, fortunately, Business Central has some tools that make assigning permissions a lot more efficient. One of those is called permission set. So permission set is how you group those detailed permissions, and that's typically done by functional area, so accounts payable, accounts receivable, etc. You can also group permissions further using something called a user group or a security group. Now, we'll talk about this more later on as well, but user group is something that is going away. It's something that still exists, but it's being replaced by security groups. And we'll get into all that in more detail. Back to you, Galen.
Yep. So we will start our conversation with permissions. So like Don said, permissions apply at the base object level. They're grouped and applied in these permission sets, and how they apply is read, insert, modify, and delete, and execute. It's very similar to, if you're familiar with the CRUD authentication or CRUD access, where create, read, etc., update. So basically, if you can read it, you can access that to see it. If you can insert it, you can make a new object. Modify is you can change an existing object. Delete is delete it, obviously get rid of it. And execute is specific to a certain type of object where you can act on it. You're not necessarily doing the inserting or deleting or seeing or anything. It's just you're running that particular object. So how you're doing those things is specified on the permission line in a permission set. So as you see here, like we're going to use the system, this D365 basic system as an example. So what you'll see here, blank means you can't do it. So if we look at payment terms, this user who is assigned this permission set cannot create a new payment term. They can't delete a payment term. They can't create a location. They can't modify or delete salesperson or purchaser codes. What they can do, based on the yes that you see here, is they can see, insert, modify, and delete standard text, country and region translation, etc. Anything you see a yes on means that they absolutely can do that thing based on this permission set. If it's blank, it means that they can't based on this permission set. Indirect is a little bit more complex, where it requires access not directly through a permission, but through something else. So the best way I explain this is, so you'll see here, GL account is indirect. What that could mean is maybe management doesn't want this user to have direct access to the chart of accounts. They don't want them going and affecting the individual charts of accounts on the chart of accounts. But they still need to be able to do things that require the chart of accounts, like posting documents and things like that. So if you give a user indirect access, they're not going to be able to go look up this table, but they are going to be able to use it. And then there's something else on the permission set here. You see all of these show include. You can also do exclude. This is super handy if there is a table that's really hard to restrict, but you know the page that it's associated with, you can block that page so that the user can't even see that table. They would still potentially have access to the data in the table, but they're not necessarily going to be able to go see it for themselves. So for instance, I was working with a client who, coming back to the GL, they didn't want their users to be able to access any GL accounts, anything GL related. So what we did was we ended up just blocking the chart of accounts page as one step, and then we were able to address the table individually.
All right. So we've looked at permissions. Now that we have an understanding of sort of some of the detail involved with permissions, we can look at how we can group those permissions into something called permission sets. Permission sets are usually functional area based. For example, there are permission sets related to accounts payable, accounts receivable, and general ledger. Business Central comes with many predefined permission sets that are a good starting point, and depending on your security requirements, might even work for you the way they are. However, usually we find that at least some user-defined permission sets will be required. We will be talking about how you can create permission sets for yourself, like user-defined permission sets, a little bit later on. There are a few different types of permission sets. There's system permission sets, so those are the ones that are predefined that come with Business Central when you get it. And then there's user-defined. Those are the custom ones that you can create and modify. And there's also extension related permission sets of type extension. So those are permission sets related to any extensions that you might have, so third-party apps and things like that. There is a special permission set called Super. This is used to grant full access to Business Central. You must have at least one user with super permissions, but it probably makes sense to have more than one. So you may want to have 2 or 3 so that you've got a backup in case that one user is not available. As mentioned earlier, you do not want everyone to be super. Best practice is to only give users the permissions that they need to do their jobs. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is nested permission sets. So this is something that's relatively new in Business Central. In the old days, there wasn't anything like this, but basically what a nested permission set is, it's a permission set that's embedded inside of another permission set. So you can see that area at the bottom that's highlighted in red, or blocked out in a red box. That is the section where you can assign nested permission sets. So the benefits of nested permission sets are that they're simplified management. You can make a change to one permission set and it will propagate automatically to the higher level permission sets that include it. They're also reusability, I guess, is another one. So some permissions are needed across functional areas. So you can create those permissions once in a permission set and then assign that permission set to other permission sets that need it. Consistency is another benefit. And it's kind of related to the reused one where because you're reusing the base permission sets, changes are applied across users. So you change that one base permission set and all the other ones that use it will be consistent. They'll all have the same settings. And then the last benefit is flexibility. So nested permission sets also have the ability to have specific permissions excluded. So that's what Galen mentioned a little bit earlier, is that not only can you include the permissions from that nested permission set, you can exclude. So you can have a base permission set that you need to give to a bunch of different functional area permission sets. And then on some of them, you might need to exclude certain things. So yeah, so now we're going to get into how can we create custom permission sets.
Right. Well, there are 4 ways. The first one, and by far the most common, is copying an existing permission set. Second one is recording. The third one is creating a permission set from scratch. And the last is importing and exporting. So copying, like I said, is probably, in my experience, by far the most common, most popular way to create a new permission set. So I'm going to actually get into my sandbox environment right here and kind of dive a little deeper into what Don said earlier. So if you see here, we have D365 Basic. It's a system permission set. And that means that I can't modify it, right? So if I wanted to get into this table here and I wanted to change standard text, if I try to click the pencil, it's not going to let me get into it. What I can do though is I can copy this permission set, and now it's become a user defined permission set, and I can do what I want with it. Another thing is some of these nested permission sets, like Don said, um, they're already included in a lot of these system permission sets. Well, a lot of these I can't just go assign myself, like dig voucher, don't know what that is. Bank deposits, don't know what that is. I know kind of generally what the functions are, but I don't know what objects they um, affect. So, what a good way of finding that out and really exploring is copying your permission sets and digging into them. So the uh, first method of copying is copying by reference. So basically, what this means is, so if I want to make a copy of basic, what we see here is we highlight whatever permission set we want to copy, and on the list page, and then copy permission set up here. So I have basic highlighted. I'm going to copy the permission set, and I'm going to call it basic new ref. Usually, if I'm working with a client, if I'm helping them with their permissions, I'll put the initials for the company at the very beginning. So I'll just put my initials here. Like we said, we have three options. We're going to copy by reference this time. Notify on changed permission. This is just if anybody else has this permission set assigned to them, it'll give them a notification through Business Central. I don't have to do that. That's just a sandbox. So I'm going to click OK. So now I have GN basic ref. Okay, so what did that do? Copying by reference. What it did was it took all of the objects that were listed up here in the lines, the granular area, and it took all of my nested permissions and made one nested included permission set. That's all it did. Um, I've not seen a lot of use for this. I'm sure it does. But it this simplifies a permission set into one. So now, unfortunately, doing this, I'm not able to dive into this anymore any further than I was able to before. So if I just open it up, it's literally just going to be the same view as I had before. What if I wanted to look at all those objects? Well, I can use the second option. So I'm going to highlight D365 Basic again, and I'm going to flat permission copy. What this does is the exact opposite of a copy by reference. And it takes a little bit longer because it's a lot more work for the system involved. And basic is kind of a big permission set. So, all right. So what you'll notice is there are no nested permissions down here. All of the permissions are in here now. So now I can tell based on this what that group of nested permissions did on basic. This is really helpful for situations like some of the heavy hitters, your customers, your items, your vendors, your GL. Um, so I see that item, I have indirect insert permission. If I didn't want to give indirect insert permission, now I can just get rid of that and move along and now assign this permission set. So that is one thing that I usually forget to mention. You can make all the permission sets that you want. You can copy all the permission sets and everything that you want. Just be sure that whenever you've copied them and you're comfortable with them, go ahead and assign them, because if you can make them, if you don't assign them, they're not doing anybody any good. The last copy, I'm not even going to get into. It's just clone. It literally copies that permission set exactly. What can be good there is if, like I said, you had a system permission set that you wanted to tweak one thing on, but you didn't necessarily want to make a flat copy. You can clone it and then tweak it that way.
Right. So the second way that we can create our own permission sets is by recording permissions. So the way this works is to like sort of the best practice for doing it is that you first thing you do is you create a script of the process steps that a particular function requires. Then you create a new permission set, and then you go into that permission set and using the actions, record permissions, and start as shown on this slide, you start the recording process. Then you go and you walk through the steps that that are required for that function. And then when you're done, when you've done all the things that you need that user to be able to do, you then go back to the permission set and you go back to record permissions and you use the stop button. And then when you do that, it'll ask you if you want to use those recorded permissions. You say yes, and it'll fill in all the permission detail on that new permission set that you just created. So it works really well as long as you've got a good script to go by. And then as a word of caution, you should always review the results of the recorded permissions to make sure that it makes sense, and always test those permissions first before assigning them to users in production. All right, so that's recording permissions. The next slide is creating permission sets from scratch. So you can also do it completely from scratch. Usually that's not a, like if you looked at that basic permission set that Galen was showing, there's a lot of objects that have different types of permission, like read, write, edit, like all these different permissions. Doing that manually would take a long time. So usually we reserve creating a permission set completely from scratch for like something really small. So like where you might only need one or two permissions granted or something like that. So another way that I've used a manual permission set is I've done it just sort of as a temporary solution. So when I'm troubleshooting user permission errors, the user's trying to do something, they get an error saying you do not have permission to such and such a table, or usually more specific, it'll say you do not have read permission to this table. So what I've done in the past is I've created a permission set called missing permissions, and it might be more specific, like missing permissions for accounts payable or something like that. And then when the user gets the error, you manually add that permission to that read access to that specific table that the error message was talking about. You add that to the permission set, you assign that to the user, and you have them continue to test. If they get another error, then you might do the same thing. You'd add that to that same missing permission set until they get through all their errors and they're able to do what they need to be able to do. Once you've gotten past sort of the urgency of making it possible for them to get their job done or whatever, then you can go back and you look at the missing permission set, and you review it and decide, okay, where should I add these permissions in the way that makes the most sense, right? So that's just sort of a temporary use of a permission set that I created from scratch. So the next slide here is just about importing and exporting. So like I said a little bit earlier, it's really important that you test your permission sets, or especially when you're first going live with Business Central, it's a good idea to test your permission, any custom or user-defined permission sets that you create. Make sure you test them before you go live. So that kind of takes us into this next slide where we're importing and exporting, right? So it's nice because you can go in to your sandbox environment, set up your user-defined permission sets, assign them to users, have them run through some testing, make sure it all works and they're not getting permission errors. When you're happy with it, that they have access to what they need and they're not seeing things they're not supposed to, then you can export those permission sets, and then you can go into your production environment and import them in, right? And then apply them accordingly. So it is quite nice for that reason.
So what we've talked about so far, it has really been on the user level, right? We've talked about permissions and permission sets, and those are generally assigned individually. But what we're going to talk about now is assigning permissions by group. First, we'll talk about user groups, which again, it's going away, but I at least want to give kind of a frame of reference for the rest of it. So like I said, it's security by group instead of user. So what you see here is in Business Central, these are user groups. So what you'll see is you have the group over here, then you have permission sets over here, the permission sets that are associated with each of these, and the users that are in each group. So what is happening here is you are creating these groups in Nav and BC. You create the group first, and then you create the permission set, or you add the permission sets to the groups, and then you add your members to the individual group. So a useful situation would be, um, say all of your salespeople need a certain set of permissions or a set of permission sets, like group of them, right? You would create a user group and call it, salespeople or something like that. Assign it all those, significant permission sets to that group, and then put all your users, your salespeople users in that group. Like I said, what makes this uh, user groups unique is that everything is done in Nav and BC. The group creation, the permission set assigning, and the adding of the members. Another tool that was helpful here was user by user group, where instead of having to assign users individually to each group, there was a grid where you could assign users to um, groups just by checking a box this way. Like Don said, user groups are going away. They're being deprecated as of Q4 2024. So pretty quick, they're going to be going away and they're not going to be available anymore. This has some of our clients worried. What I would tell you is not necessarily to worry too much about losing all your permissions. So what will happen is you're not just going to get, your people aren't just going to be like naked of permissions, right? Just because they're not assigned to a user group doesn't mean that they're not going to get permissions. What you can do ahead of time is what exactly Microsoft is going to be doing. You're going to enable a feature that will push all of those permissions from the user groups that the user is assigned to down to their user card. How you can do that right now, you go into feature management, uh, and then switch the enabled for to all users. BC will make you sign out and sign back in. But then it literally just converts all of those permissions associated with user groups to um, pushes them down to the users. What exactly does this mean? So this is an example of my user card in one of my sandboxes um, the prior to running that feature, right? So what you'll see is you'll see user groups up here and you'll see permissions down here. Of course, they're super, ignore that. But like say automate is right here. Edit in Excel, export report to Excel associated with the report. Business premium. I think local and super are the only ones strictly assigned to the card. So if I were to take away these user groups right now, I would lose, 2/3 of the permissions on this card. But running that function literally just took that user group section out of my card and assigned all these users, all these permissions to my user card instead. So you're, like I said, you're not going to lose any of your permissions. It's just going to push them out of the user groups. But what it does do is it gets rid of your user groups. So if you go to user groups after you run this function, your user groups are going to be gone. So this is definitely if you're going to do it, jump and don't look back kind of situation. Because if you're hesitant, I would say get comfortable pretty quick because Microsoft's going to push it. But if it's a difference between, doing it today, doing a little bit of research, getting ready for it, and doing it, later this week, I would probably do it later this week if you're not 100% ready. So the new best practice is something called user security groups. They work very, very similarly to user groups. Um, so the biggest difference is that the creation of the groups and the membership of those groups is managed in the Entra Admin Center. I'll show you what I'm talking about right now. apologize for the ads. It's not associated with me. So if we have, this is Entra, the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. What it used to say something to the effect of previously known as Azure Active Directory or something like that. Basically, Microsoft assumes that you're used to it by now. So what you'll see here is you have overview, users, and then groups. You used to be able to assign licenses and other things to your users in Entra, and now you have to do that in the Microsoft Admin Center. So we're going to focus more on groups here. So I go to all groups, and if I wanted to make a new group, I could add a new group right here. But I'm going to show you the existing groups. So group type, security, there it is. Here's my security groups that I've made. What I did was I made a group. I called it a security group, and then I assigned my members. Right now, I'm the only member. I can make a new one real quick, or I can add a new one real quick. I'm going to add Don here. Select. I'm going to refresh, and then Don should be a member of this group. Of course, he's not. I don't think I saved it. There he is. There it is. Okay. So this is really, really handy because if you get a new hire on and say they're in purchasing or something, you can give them all their licenses in Microsoft Admin Center, and then in Entra you go in and assign them to all their user group or security groups that they need to be in, and you don't have to think anymore about permissions or access or anything to BC. Generally, if you do those two steps, they're pretty much going to have access in BC. So what does this mean in BC? If we look at security groups in here, the screen is going to look very, very similar to the user group page. Pardon me. You have your groups over here, the associated permissions over here, and the members down here. So first and foremost, I would add a new user group. It's not, like I said, you create the user groups in Entra. You're not creating them in BC. You're adding them. So basically, if there are any security groups not already here that there are in Entra, I can select them and bring them in this way. I'm not creating it. I'm just creating the link, basically. Then I add permissions. So I can add whatever permission sets I want here. Grab that, what have you. And now the users in this group are these members have these permissions by that. So I think some of these others have different members and different permissions. Yeah, like this one doesn't have anything in it. Another way this is helpful, let's say you have a purchaser who's going to be going on vacation, so you have to have one of your sales people or your sales staff covering them for a week or two. If your purchasing user group is already set up, you just have to assign that user to it, and they get those permissions right away. And then as soon as they're done with them, as soon as you don't need them to have those permissions anymore, you go back into Entra and take them out of that group. It's as simple as that. So we see that right now, pardon me, Don and I have permission or access to this group. If I don't want Don in here anymore, sorry, Don. Refresh it, refresh. And the scrolling takes longer than the actual member management. There he is. So like I said, this is this is best practice. This is Microsoft's best practice. This is what they're pushing everyone towards. It's kind of why I think that's why they're getting rid of, or they have gotten rid of, user groups. Um, this is, I won't even call it the way of the future. This is the way of now. So this is definitely the way that I always push clients towards. Um, I'll spend extra time on it because it can be a little overwhelming at first, but once you get the hang of it, it is, it's pretty straightforward. If you can follow that kind of bouncing ball, you should be able to do it, no problem.
All right, so the one of the last sections of our presentation today is the auditing. So auditing is basically how do we know who has access to the system and what do they have access and how can we track changes to security and access. All right, so one way that we can do that is Business Central has something called effective permissions. This is useful as well when you're setting up and testing permissions. You can go to a user and as you saw, sometimes it's not simple to see, especially when there's nested permissions. It's not always easy to see what permissions a user has access or what objects a user has access to, what permissions they have. So effective permissions is something that you can do to from a user account to see exactly which objects they have access to. And it also shows you sort of how they have access to those different objects. The other thing that we want to talk about under auditing is just changelog. So changelog automatically tracks changes to several security related tables. So that's not something that you have to turn on or anything, it just happens. So if somebody's making changes to user security, that gets changed in the changelog automatically. And then the next thing about the changelog is that you can also use it to track other sort of critical or important information. You have to be careful because you changelog, like basically it creates a record every time something changes. So if you're tracking a lot of detail, you can get into trouble. All right, so this is just a more detailed slide on effective permissions. So going to a user account, clicking the effective permissions button, it opens up a page that shows you at the top part, it shows you all of their permissions, like every single object that they have access to, whether it's read, write, or sorry, read, insert, modify, or delete, or even execute. And then on the bottom section, it shows you what gave them access to. So whatever you're on the top, it'll show you what gave them access to that. So if you need to troubleshoot and say, okay, they shouldn't have read access to that table, then you can look and see where it came from and figure out what you have to do to change their permission so they no longer have that access. All right, so effective permissions is a very useful tool.
One thing I would add here is if you look here at the bottom, you have normal and then security group. Pardon me. Normal means that um, this was assigned on the user's card, either through the card or through a user group that gave the permission on the card. Security group is something that you're not going to be able to see on a user card. You can only see it in um, effective permissions, which is actually kind of cool. We had a client, Don and I worked with, that one of the heaviest users of the system had literally 0 permissions assigned on her user card. Everything was in a security group. So the last thing we'll talk about here is the change log. The change log is exactly what it sounds like. It's a log of all the changes that you want notified of in the system or logged in the system. So if some of the more popular ones are like bank accounts, customer cards, payment terms, things like that. This you can see when new records are created, when they're changed or deleted. This isn't permissions based. This is just showing you what user is doing what and when. Like Don said, if you're tracking something that changes a lot, um, you're going to run into trouble, specifically like transactional information. So if you're trying to track anytime a sales order gets changed or anything like that, you're potentially going to run into trouble because you're gonna bog down your system with all those recordings, right? So if you know what you really have to evaluate is what do you need to record? What do you need record of? are you running into issues where, records are changing and nobody's, owning it, that kind of thing. Because yeah, it could end up slowing your system down quite a bit if you just change, or if you just log everything. So that's kind of the meat of our presentation here. Additional resources. We got 95% of the like the data for this presentation in learn.microsoft.com. Pardon me. Of course, a lot of this came with experience as well, but learn.microsoft.com is a really great place to start if you need some additional assistance with um, uh, permissions and security and things like that. And with that, open the floor to questions before we hand it back over to Angie.
No questions have come through yet, Galen and Don.
Okay.
But if anybody does have any, please feel free to type them into the questions box and we'll get them answered.
All right.
Is there
With
any
that,
common questions that you guys get asked on a frequent basis?
honestly, what I get asked the most is just to help set up security groups. That's the most popular thing. That how how does this work? Who needs to do it? That's kind of the one big thing too, to make sure who can do it. Not everybody has access to Entra, right? Make sure you know who your IT type people are, your administrators are, so that they are in the know of what you need. Try to have somebody in-house if you can. A lot of clients we work with, especially the smaller clients, they work with a third-party IT company, and it kind of slows down response times when, say, somebody has to get added or removed from a security group. To have to rely on somebody outside of the organization can be a headache. But that's kind of number one. Number two is error handling. So like Don mentioned before, if you get a permission error, it's going to say something to the effect of permissions don't allow this. It'll list off whatever the object is, the object type, the object ID, so that object type is that table data, table page, things like that, and then the access required. So is it read access? Is it create, modify, delete access? But reading that and identifying what needs to happen from there, those are kind of the big things that I get asked all the time. I'll give a presentation on security, have like an hour long, one-to-one Q&A afterwards, but I'll still get questions of, hey, I got this error, what do I do? So it's really just important to know what the objects are, what they do, what the permissions to those objects are, and how to read it in effective permissions and how to address it from there.
Okay,
Yeah, and
sounds great.
I would just add one more thing. So used to be all Business Central's gotten a lot better than the old days, but we used to have issues where sometimes a user would have permission to something, and the question would be, well, how do they have access to this? I can't figure out where they're getting that permission from. But that's where that effective permissions tool comes in. It's very easy to track down where they're getting the permission from and making the change. So, but yeah, that's it.
Okay, well, thanks guys for the great presentation. Like I said, if anybody has any questions, you can contact us after the fact, or you can contact your customer success manager. And info@inovia.com is our email address, so feel free to ask us any further questions. And you can also check out our resource page on our website. That's on the screen as well. And I also put it in the chat for you to reference. That way you can take a look at all of our Business Central content and events. And I just want to thank Galen and Dawn for the presentation. And thanks for everyone joining us today. or if you're watching this on demand, we thank you for taking the time out to watch the presentation. And be sure to take our survey as you exit the webinar. Your responses will help us with future material and improvement. All right, well, thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you soon at another Innovia webinar. Take care, everyone.